Well, welcome everyone to the third session of Beyond the Moon and Stars. We're so delighted that you are here. Today, our third session is with Sister Jean deBlois. Sister Jean is formerly retired from, actually so many things she's retired from. But as you may recall from reading Jean's biography, you know, she is certainly well qualified to be speaking on what she's speaking today. But it was really during our preparation session, Sister Jean, that as I shared with you, one of the things you said that really made a big difference for me. And in fact, as I said to you, you know, that to me is the hope that underlies everything for Beyond the Moon and Stars. And that is to provide a context of faith through which to look at some of the decisions and way we approach our end of life. So I'm beyond thrilled that you're here. I never knew you till you agreed to do this session. And I've so enjoyed getting to know you, and I know our people will as well. So in speaking about how to begin today, Sister Jean and I agreed we're going to play our Beyond the Moon and Stars song, and Sister has selected a beautiful scripture passage that blends well with the theme for today and the theme of her presentation. So to begin, I'm going to ask you to hold your candle. You brought your candle. And just take a minute, if you will, with me and page through and look at all of the people who you are gathered with here today. We're gathered from the east and west and north and south today. So many beautiful faces on this screen with us. Especially for those of us who live alone, take a look and see all the people you are gathered with. This is the moment where if we were in a live event, we would be nudging each other. Come on, let's go find our chair. Let's make a decision in our heart to come forward together.
Beyond the moon and stars, as deep as night, so great our hunger, Lord, to see your light.
I've selected a few verses from Psalm 36 for our opening and concluding prayer. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light, we see light. Amen.
Amen. Okay, well, Jean, if you're ready for us, I'll go ahead and bring your PowerPoint up and we can dive right in. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right. We practiced this earlier. Yay! Are you able to see the screen, Jean?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's good to be with you. I appreciate you even showing up. The topic that I'm talking about today is stewarding the gift of life. And it's a topic that I've been involved in for about 40 years as an ethicist in Catholic healthcare. So I have an agenda. Next slide. I don't presume that you do not understand Catholic teaching and what it means to be human, but this might be just a little bit of a different way of thinking about it. So that's the first thing on the agenda. The second thing is to look at how we make decisions in the Catholic Christian tradition with regard to issues at end of life, when life is threatened by illness or injury. And the final thing on the agenda is the importance of accompanying with persons as death approaches. I think one of the biggest, saddest tragedies of COVID was seeing so many people die alone, without their loved ones around them, without friends around them, and sometimes without even healthcare professionals in a presence that you could touch. So that's our agenda. Next slide. Probably 15 years ago, at least, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops wrote this little document called the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. And it is intended to help people who work in Catholic healthcare and who become involved in Catholic healthcare as patients, for example, or families, to understand what it means to be Catholic and to preserve the identity of who this ministry is as Catholic. And in that document, the bishops say this: the truth that life is a precious gift from God has profound implications for the question of stewardship. We are not the owners of our lives, and hence we don't have absolute power over life. We have a duty to preserve our life and to use it for the glory of God. Now, if you reflect on this statement for a little while, you're going to see some things jump out that in our American culture, many people would challenge. The first is, we're not owners of our lives, we're stewards. We hold this gift in trust for the one who gives it, because it's going to be turned back to that one when we move into new life at the end of our lives. We don't have absolute power over life, although there are many in our society who think we do. And I'll mention this again a little later, but the movement that's called Death with Dignity that wants to legalize assisted suicide, and in some cases, active euthanasia, would like to say, no, we have absolute power over life. It's my life. I can do what I want with it. But in the Christian Catholic tradition, we see that we have a duty to preserve our lives, not just for our own good, but to use it for the glory of God. So one of the things I'd ask you to reflect on later today or some other time, how do you use your life for the glory of God? Next slide. I love this little picture. with the saying, fearfully and wonderfully made on the foot of a little baby. In Catholic teaching, and in much of the Christian tradition and beyond as well, we think similarly about what it means to be a human person. First and foremost, we believe that we are created in God's image. Now, that doesn't mean we look like God, because we don't know what God looks like. But it does mean that we have inalienable dignity, dignity that cannot be taken away by somebody else, dignity that I cannot say, forget it, I want to give it up. It's inalienable. Now, I can treat somebody as if they had no dignity, and we've certainly seen that over the past, I don't know, several months or maybe a couple of years in our country, that there are some people that we don't believe have dignity or inestimable worth. But in our tradition, because God shares, and when I was thinking about beyond the moon and stars and the theme of light, what God shares with us in terms of his image or her image is the light that is God is implanted in us. And our job is to show forth that light. I re-listened to, I can't remember her name now, Poet Laureate's wonderful poem at the inauguration, where she says, we have to have the courage to see the light, but moreover, we have to have the courage to be the light in the world. And from a Christian perspective, that is God's light. The second piece of what we believe about the human person is that our autonomy is not absolute. We are stewards of this precious gift, and we will be asked at the end of our life, whenever that comes, to account for our stewardship responsibilities. Another thing that is certainly characteristic of the Catholic Christian tradition in understanding what it means to be human is that we're social by nature. I don't just choose to opt out of being social. I'm born into a social setting. I'm born into a family. I'm born into a community. What that means about making decisions at the end of life, again, no matter when that comes, is that these are communal decisions. I've known people over the course of my professional life who say, well, I'm going to make decisions about myself and what I want, but I'm not going to tell anybody. It's nobody's business. Well, it is their business because we're born into community. The next one is probably the most difficult to understand from the Catholic tradition's perspective, and that is that life is purposeful. We're not put here by God to simply exchange gases with the atmosphere. We're here to develop a life based on certain values, certain faith perspectives, and to live out the life pursuing those purposes. Now, I don't know how many of us are on this call, but I suppose if we had the opportunity to ask at least 10 of you, what do you think the purpose of your life is? We'd come up with 10 different things. And finally, of course, we Christians believe in a resurrection destiny. I wish I could tell you what that looks like. I don't know, but it is the heart of our belief. Every morning at Mass, our celebrant begins with, and I'm not going to sing it because I'm a terrible singer, Christ has died, and we respond, Christ is risen. And we respond, Christ is risen indeed. And we do that 3 times. I think we need to remind ourselves that there is life beyond this. There is life beyond death. And go into that with a belief that we'll find out when we get there. Next slide, please. So when we start talking about or thinking about making decisions around end of life, treatments, etc., I think we have to admit that we have a number of challenges posed by our society. The first is this: we live in the midst of a culture of denial. In 1976, I think it was, sociologist and anthropologist Ernst Becker, wrote a little book, and if you can find it, I advise you to read it, called The Denial of Death. And his premise is that we, particularly in our society, in our culture, spend an inordinate amount of time denying that we're on, from the moment that we're born, that we're on the path to moving toward our own death. When I was younger, I used to laugh at some of the commercials that we saw that participated in this culture of denial. You know, you can smear stuff on your hair to make it no longer gray. You can smear stuff on your face to make those wrinkles go away. There's always something that we can do to deny the fact that we are in constant movement towards our own death. And I don't want to be morbid about it, but that's just the reality. The second piece, the second thing that's a challenge as we try to make these good decisions at end of life is the predominance of the medical model, which focuses on rescue and cure over care. Now, I live with one other sister of St. Joseph, and we happen to be addicted to the TV show ER. And I'm a former registered nurse who worked in critical care, so I know what I'm talking about here. They do everything to everybody in ER. No matter what shape you're in, you get CPR, you get a chest tube, you get a breathing tube. That's the medical model at work. And in my experience, I worked a few times in the emergency room. People in the ER don't want to hear about, we're going to let this person die. They're there to save lives. That leads me to the next challenge, popular media and hard cases. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. And several years ago, I got a call from a friend who worked at a Catholic health system that a young man in his late 20s had been brought into their hospital after having experienced a ruptured cyst in his brain. And he was in the hospital for a long time. And it became clear to the neurologists and neurosurgeons that he was never going to recover. Too much of his brain was damaged. And then Archbishop Justin Regali, because the young man had a feeding tube and his wife wanted it removed so he could be allowed to die, the Archbishop said, not in a Catholic hospital, you can't do that. That's tantamount to murder. And that got a lot of press in St. Louis and I think around the country. It ended up that to allow Stephen to die, we had to take him home and care for him at home for the last few days of his life without a feeding tube, without any other medical interventions. I happened to be the nurse that took care of him, and I kept him clean. I kept him as comfortable as I thought he could be. But there was no use in prolonging what was inevitable. And the final challenge has to do with the overuse of life-sustaining interventions, driven by the following: the technologic imperative. The technologic imperative has been around for a long time. And it basically says, if you can do something, you must do it. So if you can put a person on a ventilator, you must do it. If you can put in 6 pints of blood, you must do it. Without asking the question, well, is it going to do the person any good? We all know about the litigious nature of American society and the way we've relied over the years on the courts to make moral decisions. Because physicians and others wouldn't listen to family members. Probably the most notarized case was that of Nancy Beth Cruzian, who, following a single car accident, ended up in a persistent vegetative state in a nursing home someplace in Missouri. And her family, after 8 years, I believe it was, asked to have her feeding tube removed. And the organization where she was, the nursing home where she was, said, no way, we're not going to do that. Well, her case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And finally, they gave them some relief and allowed her feeding tube to be removed so that she could be allowed to die. The next challenge has to do with the relative failure of advanced directives. In 1991, following the Nancy Beth Cruzan case, the United States Congress passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, which sought to make it legal for people to make their wishes known about end-of-life decision-making in things called advance directives. And we'll get to those in a bit. But I can tell you, I took a friend to the emergency room about 4 weeks ago for what turned out to be nothing except a scare. They're supposed to, by law, ask you if you have an advance directive when you go into the hospital. Nobody asked. That's why I call it the relative failure. And then finally, what I would call a creeping vitalism that says any life is better than no life. My mother, when she was in her late 60s, developed the early stages of dementia, and for the next 3 or 4 years, progressed very quickly through dementia. She had a stroke, and they called me to the nursing home where she was. And I went in, and the doctor was there. And she had had a stroke, I believe it was a brainstem infarct, so that she was totally flaccid. Anything that was meaningful for her was no longer possible because she didn't have any function well, I'm going to be bragging here. The most important thing to my mother was me, because I'm an only child. And as you can tell, I'm a wonder what. So whenever I would go to the nursing home, even though she couldn't talk, she couldn't eat, she couldn't walk, when she'd see me, a light would go on in her eyes, and she'd put her hand out and touch my face. And I knew she knew who I was. Well, the day she had the stroke, that went away. And the doctor said, well, now we have to put in a feeding tube. I said, why? Are you going to bring back her ability to recognize me and to laugh at my jokes and to listen to my music? No. So I said, no feeding tube. And we'll get back to that again in a little bit. Next slide, please. Several decades ago, a wonderful ethicist named Dan Callahan founded the Hastings Center, and he ran it for 20 or 30 years. During that time, he wrote a few books, and some of them are about end of life. This one is called The Troubled Dream of Life. He says in that book that, as a rule, doctors don't talk comfortably and directly with patients about death. A worry about malpractice, a zest for technology, a deep-seated moral belief in the need to prolong life, and the pressure of families and others still often lead to overtreatment and an excessive reliance on technology. Next slide, please. This is kind of a little picture of what that's about. The doctor says to the patient, medical ethics do not allow me to assist you in your death. I am, however, permitted to keep you miserable as long as possible. I've seen this over and over again. The inability of a doctor to deal with his or her, I think, own feelings about approaching death of a patient or a relative, and they keep people in the dark. I hope this is okay that I say this, Lori, but Lori told me the story of her uncle who was dying, and the doctor didn't talk to him, and her mother went in and sat down by the bed and held her uncle's, or I don't know if it was her grandfather's, face in her hands. And her mother said, are you afraid? Do you want to talk about it? But nobody else would. And her uncle or grandfather said, yes, I'm afraid. And yes, I do want to talk about it. So there's a lot of challenges that we face in terms of making good decisions at the end of life. So now let's go on to look at a little bit more about what stewarding the gift of life might mean for us. Next slide. At the first level, we believe that life, as I said before, is a fundamental, it's a gift, it's a precious gift and a basic human good. Now, when an ethicist says that something is a basic human good, it means that we may never directly turn our wills against that. That's what a basic human good is. So we have an ordinary duty to preserve and prolong our life. This goes to speak about our responsibility to take care of ourselves, to eat correctly, to exercise appropriately, even as simple as getting enough sleep. So an ordinary duty to preserve and prolong life. I just can't say tomorrow morning, well, I'm kind of tired of this life. I think I'll stop eating, which, as you can tell from seeing me, would be very unlikely. We have an ordinary duty to preserve life. Secondly, we cannot have any intent to kill or directly to cause death. Now, when I told some friends of mine that I told the doctor treating my mother not to put in a feeding tube, they said, well, weren't you killing her? I said, no, my intent was not to kill her. My intent was not to do something that would be burdensome for her, knowing what the side effects of feeding tubes are in people in the kind of condition my mom was in. So no intent to kill or directly cause death. Now, that doesn't mean I can't foresee when death is coming. I knew my mother was going to die when I said no feeding tube. I was not happy that that was going to be the outcome, but it gave me the opportunity to stay with her for the last days of her life, 8 days it took her to die, to give her little sips of water if she could take it, to hold her, to sing to her. I foresaw that she was going to die, but in no way did I intend it. Life is not an absolute good. It's a relative good. We don't have an absolute duty to preserve it. There are times when we arrive at limits to maintain life, and we do that via a burden-benefit analysis in the presence of a fatal pathology. Now, I'm going to unpack this a little bit more. Next slide. A fatal pathology is anything that will cause death if allowed to run its course. So pneumonia can be a fatal pathology. Diabetes is a fatal pathology. If you are an insulin-dependent diabetic and you don't take your insulin, you will die. If you have end-stage renal disease and you don't have either a kidney transplant or go on dialysis, you will die. When a fatal pathology is present, and by the way, a fatal pathology is not diagnosed by me or you, it's diagnosed by a physician. When a fatal pathology is present, a decision must be made to either attempt to cure it, if we can, or to alleviate or circumvent its effects, or to allow it to run its course and let death follow. So pneumonia in an ordinary healthy person is not necessarily a fatal pathology, particularly in light of the fact that I have a duty to preserve my life. And so if the doctor says, well, I can give you a course of antibiotics to take care of your pneumonia, I have a duty to take those antibiotics. But in a person with advancing dementia or in metastatic cancer who develops pneumonia, that the limit to preserve that life may have been met, and they may not have a duty to take the penicillin or the other antibiotics that are prescribed. Next slide. And this is where we get into making assessments about benefit and burden. Now, I want to just caution at the outset before I get into beneficial. Every medical intervention has an effect, but not every effect is beneficial. So, as I just said, a person with advancing Alzheimer's in the late stages of dementia, giving them a medication to take care of their pneumonia may certainly clear up the pneumonia, but that's an effect of it. The question is, will it be beneficial for that person? When I was a young sister and a young nurse, we used to call pneumonia the old man's friend. And sometimes it is. So interventions are beneficial when they allow a person a reasonable ability to pursue the purposes of human life. And I mentioned the purposes of human life at the beginning of this presentation. That's the way I've put my life together. I'm a woman religious who's taken vows. I live in community with other sisters. I studied forever. I went to college for more years than most people are alive. But that's the way life made sense to me. And you put your lives together in very different ways. You have spouses, you have families, you have careers. And those things constitute the purposes of life. An intervention is beneficial when it allows you to pursue those purposes. Maybe not 100%, nothing's 100%, but enough so you feel like your life is being fulfilled. The next bullet point says that when a person has a chronic debilitating, that's okay, just leave that there. Okay, a debilitating fatal pathology like Alzheimer's, which gradually diminishes the ability to pursue life's purposes. The decision about the benefit of medical interventions becomes more complex. Okay, next slide. Assessing benefit really requires good communication by a physician. That they can tell you, that 10 times out of 100, this doesn't work. Or 1 time out of 10, this intervention can be very helpful. But that requires good communication by the physician. Assessing burden is a much more subjective thing. I know what burden means for me. I don't know what it means for you. It is commonly referred to as the harm, the pain, the suffering, or other limitations imposed by medical interventions, which seriously impedes striving for the purposes of life again. So, for example, if I'm going to be in excruciating pain in the present moment, or if I'm going to have to live indefinitely on a ventilator, those can be seen as serious burdens that can limit the duty to preserve and prolong life. This assessment, according to Pius XII in 1958, by the way, he was giving a talk to a group of anesthesiologists, and he said it's quite reasonable when thinking about making end-of-life decisions to take into account the physiologic and psychic suffering of patients and families, as well as financial and social impact. Now, there are some people who think that we shouldn't take into account the financial and social impact. So I've had conversations with some people who say, well, that 30-year-old mother of 3 who now has stage 3 cancer should not use up all their financial resources trying to get over the cancer and put their family at risk so that their kids can't go to college. Well, Pius XII took a very different view of that. Financial impact should be taken into account. It shouldn't be the only thing, but it should be taken into account. Next slide. In that document I referred to earlier by the United States Catholic Conference, they talk about the right of a person to be as pain-free as possible as death approaches. Now, in my view, pain is a distraction from what one ought to be doing as death approaches, like tending to one's loved ones, repairing broken relationships, etc. The bishops say here, a person has the right to prepare for his or her death while fully conscious and should not be deprived of that without a compelling reason. So if person cannot be made comfortable without making them sleepy or putting them to sleep, the caregivers must get an informed consent to do that, to give pain suppressing medication. Probably the most difficult thing in the directives is that last statement there that says patients experiencing suffering at the end of life that cannot be alleviated should be helped to understand or appreciate the Christian understanding of redemptive suffering. Suffering is a totally different thing than pain. It's an existential angst about what it means to be alive. This is where good team care is important. Next slide, please. And the final two slides are about advanced directives. Each person can identify, and this is by the American bishops, a surrogate to make decisions for them in the event that they lack the capacity to do so for themselves. I'm not going to say too much about this slide, except that the person that you choose should know you very well. I've had adults say that, well, I'm not going to make my spouse my surrogate because I don't want him to worry. I thought, well, who knows you better than your spouse? So you need to have a conversation, more than one conversation, with the person that you decide you want to be your agent, in fact, that's what it's called, in the event that you can't make decisions on your own behalf. If that person cannot make those decisions for you, or if you haven't executed an advanced directive, then we turn to the people who know the patient's wishes best, usually family members and loved ones. And the final slide. The two main kinds of advanced directives are a living will or a durable power of attorney for healthcare. A living will is simply a document that you sign. I don't think in most states you have to have it notarized. It's a living will that says, when I'm terminally ill and death is imminent, don't do anything to prolong my dying. Now, I've always thought it odd that we would need a piece of paper to say that. Why would you want to prolong somebody's dying when they're terminally ill and death is imminent? But this is the American healthcare system. The best kind of document, I think, is a durable power of attorney for healthcare, where you can appoint someone that you know, that you trust to make decisions on your behalf when you can't do that for yourself. The most important thing about doing a durable power of attorney is that you talk to the people or the person that you want to exercise decision-making capacity for you. I had a talk at a parish one time here in St. Louis, excuse me, and there was a woman who was, I guess, in her 70s, and she brought her adult children to the talk, and it was about this stuff. And she had made her adult daughter, oldest daughter, her surrogate, but she didn't tell her adult son or her other daughter. Well, I almost had to break it up. They were fighting so much before they got out of the meeting. We all know that these are difficult decisions, and we need the help of those around us, including our caregivers, chaplains, ethics committees, you name it, to make these good decisions. And we need to pray. We need to rely on our faith. And I would say, in the words of our poet laureate, we need to have the courage to see the light that we are and to be the light that God has placed in us as we move toward turning our lives back to God. Lori, I'll turn it back to you.
I wondered if you would answer this question, Jean. let's say that I have made no arrangements for myself. I have not had any of these discussions. I am assuming after attending a session like this, I would need to do a measure of self-reflection and thinking about some of these things and then take some action. So could you, summarize, like, let's say I really wanted to move forward with some of the things you've talked about today. Could you summarize what my next step should be?
Well, if you've done nothing, do penance. If you've done nothing, yeah, do something. I'd say one of the first things you ought to do is find out where you can access an advance directive. That would be at any hospital, and Catholic hospitals certainly have them. You can get on the website of the Catholic Health Association, www.chausa.org, and I'll put that in the references that I'll give you.
Okay.
But you have to start talking to your family and your loved ones and your friends about what you want for yourself and what you hope they would want for you. I've seen so many cases, and it's so sad, where a person has not made any plans, hasn't talked to a single living soul, and then, gets run over by a bus on Grand Avenue and taken to the emergency room, and nobody knows what to do because there's no direction. And that's when they do everything. And once everything is started, it's extraordinarily difficult to get it to stop. So I'd say, get yourself an advance directive. Start talking to people.
To the people in my life?
Well, not the people on the street, but yeah, the people in your life.
One of the times when we were preparing for this presentation, you offered an observation that I thought was really interesting. You talked about in your early days when you were a nurse, and you were a nurse when kind of the whole thing was CPR and all of this started, extending life and the measures that we can take. And you had an observation about the language that we use.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so I was a critical care nurse and a supervisor in a cardiac medical ICU when I was 24 years old, which is ridiculous. But anyway, so I went to every code in the hospital, and until the attending physician got there, I ran it. And I started to listen to what we said to one another when a patient died. And that's what we never said. We would say, first of all, he didn't make it, meaning we didn't fail, but the patient failed. Or we'd say, we lost that one. And I would say to myself, no, we didn't lose him. He's right there in the bed in front of us. He just happens to be dead. Or then we'd say, this is the worst one. We'd go out to the waiting room to where the family was, and we'd say, I'm sorry, but your husband expired. Like he was a parking meter. Like we could put in more money and get more time, or, the library book. We could go pay our fine and get more time. We have a difficult time with death in our culture, and we see it all the time. Just watch ER. It's on Channel 19 every day.
We're receiving a question from a participant, Sister Jean. When is the DNR appropriate? A do not resuscitate order. When is that appropriate?
Well, it's appropriate. For example, if a person has metastatic CA, metastatic cancer, if a person has end-stage dementia, if a person, now this is my view, not a lot of people don't agree with this. If a person is in their late 70s and lives in a nursing home, you have to know what DNR, what resuscitation looks like. I've resuscitated a lot of people, and the first thing you do is pound on their chest to see if you can start their heart. And then you start doing cardiac compressions. And then you generally, if you're in an ER or someplace, they put a tube down their throat so you can hook them up to a machine to breathe. DNR is appropriate. Well, it's appropriate. I mean, for anybody who doesn't want to go through that, actually. But it's generally reserved for people who've got some kind of long-term debilitating illness that doing CPR will not bring them back to a better condition than they were in. That's true with Dan Callahan that I mentioned earlier. I believe it was him, wrote about that and got roundly criticized for saying, you know, people in nursing homes can be DNR. Well, the problem is, unless CPR was intended for people who suffer because of cold water drowning and electrocution, witnessed. Most people who have, CPR done for them, they've been found in the bedroom or in the pool in the backyard, or they had a stroke on the street. If it's not started immediately, the chances of it being resuscitative are minimal, in my view.
I was thinking that
Again, you got to talk to people about this.
I really found the conversation you had about kind of what, you know, we preserve life, but on the other hand, where you talked about the pathology, what's the pathology? Then you use the pneumonia as an example, and what's our duty there? And I would think that that kind of distinction would be really helpful in making a decision about a DNR order.
Right. Well, first you have to know what a fatal pathology is. It's something that will take life unless we circumvent its effects or cure it. So, for example, a person who's got end-stage renal disease and lives on dialysis might want to have a DNR. I don't know if I've taken care of people on dialysis. I wouldn't want to survive that way. Now, that doesn't mean that people who do survive that way are doing anything wrong. Many people can survive in a very fulfilling way, living on dialysis. But if you have a fatal pathology that is sometime going to run its course, you might want to think about a DNR. There's another document that I did not refer to, and it's called a POLST, Physician Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. It's not an advance directive. It's not legal in every state, so I would suggest that you look it up, POLST, and that you get a physician to write an order for DNR if you want, or put me on a ventilator, or don't put me on a ventilator. But you have to find a physician who's willing to work with you on that. And again, you have to speak with your loved ones and your family and your friends so that they, because we're social by nature. These are social decisions and they affect the communities of which you're a part.
Well, I was thinking, you know, mostly when it really is about remembering that we are stewarding this gift of life that God has given us, and that we're here for a purpose. And it's only in that context that we can really look at these bigger decisions. You know, a DNR order would be connected to that purpose and that mission that I feel like God has brought me here to this earth. So I really can see the critical role of that prayer and reflection and knowing yourself and knowing kind of the framework that you've laid out for us today, how all of those pieces together, there's no one answer. It's all of those pieces together that make my unique answer to these questions.
Right. There's a wonderful book by Henry Nouwen. And in that book, he talks about the fact that we are responsible for our living and our dying. And we're responsible not to cling to life so much that we diminish ourselves and diminish others. And that takes a lot of personal reflection and a lot of prayer and a lot of trust.
If you'll permit me, I'd like to share that I was with my mom when she died. And, you know, her whole last day was really just a gift. And I was ever since I've had that experience, it was 5 years in October, whenever anybody says, I really think my mom should do this, or my dad should do this, or my brother. I always say to them, based on my experience, their dying is their own business, and their spirit is going to guide you. Don't you try to make those decisions for them unless you've had, like you talked about earlier, those conversations. People's dying, my dying belongs to me, and I have an obligation to die in the same manner that I lived.
Absolutely.
I think that was such a, ever since I had that experience, I just say to anybody, how they are living and dying that's theirs to do.
Right.
It's ours to steward it and not be afraid of it. So,
And the definition I like of steward is that it's a person who holds a gift gently with open hands,
mm-hmm.
so that the giver of the gift can take it back whenever he or she wills.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So it's not to cling to life.
Mm-hmm. That is a beautiful note to end on. I think, I love reading often chosen for a funeral says the souls of just are in the hands of God. And I think as we look at these questions about how will I die, to remember that whole time I'm trying to make those decisions, my life is being held in those loving hands, as it has been all my life. So we're receiving a lot of questions asking for resources and will this session be recorded? And the answer is yes to everything. We will get all the quotes that Jean used today, any references or books or any links that Sister Jean has that will be a good follow-up for you to consider to this session. Next week after our last session, you'll receive an email with a link to all 4 talks of this series. So you'll get to watch it again and share it with anybody who you would like to, who you think would find it helpful. So our last session number 4 is tomorrow. It'll be with Mr. Michael Murphy, and we're really looking forward to that session as well, who's going to kind of continue with the idea of looking at how we live on after we're gone and how those decisions that we make today will impact on that. So with that, you'll receive a reminder email about an hour before the session tomorrow. It'll be the same link. I get a lot of questions. Is it the same link? The answer is yes, but we'll send you a reminder email about an hour before. So with that, Sister, may I turn it over to you for a closing prayer?
Sure. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light, we see light. Amen.
Amen. Amen, everyone.
Amen.
We will see you all tomorrow. Bye now.